Hello, everyone. This is Makinde Ayodeji, African storyteller and the creator of the Afro-urban motion comic series Alamu, Diary of a Street Lagosian. Yeah, we are back for the part two of the season one. And I must say, how did you find episode six? What part of the story stood out for you the most? Which aspect of the story did you enjoy and have fun with? For me, I would say I had a lot of favorite parts, to be honest. But one part that I really enjoyed the most was the local restaurant part. Of course, today local restaurants are not really popular in the mainstream again like they used to be before in Africa, you know, especially in Nigeria where I grew up from. Uh, Back then, we used to have them very prominent, but today I think we have had a lot of the modern day restaurants taking over, which is why I actually decided to bring that, you know, that back in the story because it used to be part of the, culture of the people when we talk about the local restaurants, which we back in Nigeria call bukas. That's what we called them back in the days. I think my first experience with a localized restaurant called Buka was over 15 years ago in my university days in Obafemi Awolowo University. Basically, one of the things that stood out for me most about the Bukas, the local restaurant, is the localized way people eat. You rarely would see people eat swallow with forks. Instead of that, you will see, guys sweating on the food, punch by punch, throwing in the, swallows and, battling frantically with it. And the tastes are always very unique, the setting very local, but there's always this, fantastic taste about the food. And I think I just decided to bring that back, to the story. Yeah, that will lead me to the topic of the day that talks about African storytelling. What is actually in the context of comics now? What is unique? What stands out African storytelling, basically in the comic world, particularly. I think over the years there has been this, philosophical discourse about comics in the African sphere. That what makes a comic African? Do you, as an African, have to necessarily have to create African comics, or you just create or just create comics for general consumption? Do you necessarily, as an African, have to create an African comic? Well, I would say that I would give a personal take on that. When I say personal, I mean everybody is free to disagree with that, but then it's just a personal view that I've gathered over the years in my, time of creating comics and telling African stories. I think one thing I would say is that if you have a story to tell, please tell it. That's the first important thing. Tell your story and don't allow the philosophical discourse and arguments about is this African, is this not African, to actually distort you from telling whatever story you want to tell. It's always good for you to tell your story the way you want to tell it. I think that's the first advice I would give to any African storyteller or writer out there. Um, Secondly, I would say this that over the years, if you come to my library today, for instance, I have African comics, I have Western comics, I have African novels, I have Western novels. Basically, just from the angle of storytelling, because you can't take storytelling away from writing when it comes to comics. Now, while I would agree that in terms of storytelling, there are things to learn from the Western side. For instance, when it comes to settings and an understanding of setting, plots, character depth, story depth. I would say, yeah, from the Western point of view, there's a lot to learn from that. From their hand, basically, I would agree with that. But I would also say that when it comes to the African context, there will be a disconnect if you are an African writing a story within the African context, and there is nothing in the story to show the way of life, to show the culture of the people you are talking about. That's why I feel that when you're telling a story within the African context, you don't particularly have to westernize everything. Basically, there has to be a connection, basically, to the people you are talking about. And I would say that when it comes to African comics, we have a very rich culture. And of course, when I talk about culture, I necessarily do not mean you have to talk about the African gods. And Africa, they have their own unique way of life, which is interesting, and every aspect of the way of life of Africans is actually rich. Let me give you an example. When I went to the United Kingdom, I discovered something very interesting. I discovered that their auto mechanic culture is way different from what we have in Nigeria, West Africa. Their repair culture, for instance, in terms of cars, it's not that intense as what we have here. But when you come to a place like Nigeria, using Nigeria as a point of reference now for Africa, just so that we can, keep it simple, the repair culture is intense. We repair virtually everything. You talk about the fan belt, you talk about the changing of the tires, you talk about the battery, you talk about we repair virtually everything in a car. So the auto mechanic culture in a place like Nigeria, for instance, is so intense. And so when I discovered that, I felt, wow, there's a story here. There's culture, for instance. A way of life in that area is different. Immediately, I saw the story. And those are some of the things that informed what I came about in Alamu, the Afro-urban story. Before now, for instance, I've written, I think I wrote a story on Afrofuturism in 2020. In 2016 now, I wrote something on Afrofantasy, that's in Jerry. So really, across all genres, I still feel that no matter the direction you write, if you are creating a story within the African context, there must be something about the culture of the people, a particular aspect of their culture reflected in your story that will stand out your comic work as an African storyteller. That's what I believe. You don't have to westernize everything. If you westernize everything, then there is really, nothing different between your comic and probably a Marvel or a DC comic, particularly. And there's something that has to stand it out, basically. Yeah, I think another aspect of the Western style of storytelling, some of the things I learned, while growing up in storytelling with the Western style, is their depth of research. It's highly commendable. I mean, I would read some stories, espionage stories, and it would literally be as if, I'm taking a lecture in that area, so detailed. Yeah, I feel that's an aspect that when it comes to storytelling within the African context in comics, we could learn from. And when I was writing Alamu, for instance, one of the things I did was I had to use a setting, a slum in Lagos State called Ajegule. It's very popular. Now, in all honesty, till today, I've never been in Ajegule slum. I've never been there. But what I did at that time, was to watch enough documentaries. I did a lot of background research on Ajegule just to know the nuances there, the uniqueness about the place, the street, the street language, the slang, so many things about the place. That's on one side. Now, when it comes to the auto mechanic culture, now I've been growing up in Nigeria for over 30 years. I've been in the auto mechanic villages severally. But then I still felt that in being able to understand the culture of that ecosystem called the mechanic village, I needed to, do a more in-depth research. So I literally had to get on the phone with a very senior mechanic, auto mechanic person, interviewed him, asked him various questions, here and there, so many questions, took down notes on so many aspects, just to be able to understand the ecosystem of the auto mechanic practice in Africa, Nigeria now, as a point of reference, basically. And that informed my story. Now, because what African storytellers have to understand is that the more well researched your story is, the more depth your story carries. And the more easily people are able to connect with the story you are telling because it's not shallow. People are able to relate with it, basically. So those are some of the things I feel personally because the African culture and way of life is unique. And so when we research in writing or in telling our stories, people are able to easily connect with it more because we are not telling stories on the surface. It's not a story told on the surface, basically. Yeah. So I think at this point I would, like to do a shout out. There are a lot of fantastic brands out there that are championing African storytelling. I call them, my colleagues in the industry, and they're doing so well. A shout out to brands like Epoch Comics, shout out to Vortex, shout out to Pedal Studios, shout out to the Comic Republic, the fantastic Comic Republic. Uh, Shout outs to Unique Studios and also to Eaton Comic, Utopia, and Zebra Comics. I mean, these guys are doing fantastically well when it comes to not just telling stories, not just publishing comics, but telling authentic African stories. And I think the future of we are not as big as African comics are not as big as probably the Marvels or the DCs or the Western, brands out there. But I think the future is bright for us once we understand our direction, basically. That's my personal opinion. Yes, challenges on funding and all that we probably remain will remain a big deal for some time because Africa on its own, I'm not sure we have that well developed infrastructure for funding or kickstarters like they have abroad. But I think somehow one day we get there. Yeah, so I would like to draw the curtain here, and I would say don't miss the next episode of Alamu coming next week. The title is Ajegule Love. I've read comic stories love stories, the Lewis and Clark stories of Superman, fantastic. But then here, you've not read a love story in the slum. And you're going to enjoy this. Don't miss out on Ajegule Love next week. There is nothing as good as a fantastic love story. So, hope to see you next week. Don't forget to drop your comments on. You can drop your comments on YouTube. Tell us what you feel. Tell us how we are enjoying our stories. Let's know your thoughts. Let's talk. Let's have a rapport. Thank you and enjoy your day. Bye.